They called him the Beast of Rome, a man who set his city ablaze and called it art. In the beginning, there was light. Nero was young, handsome, and adored. He spoke with the voice of a poet, walked with the grace of an artist. Rome saw in him not a tyrant, but a savior, the golden boy who would restore the glory of Augustus. He loved music, theater, and beauty. He believed himself chosen by the gods, a being born not of flesh but of divine marble, carved for greatness. For a moment, Rome believed it too. But beneath that perfection lay a darkness waiting to breathe. Power came easily, and with it came indulgence. The adoration of millions turned into a drug he could not live without. Every cheer fed his vanity, every whisper fueled his paranoia. Soon, the poet vanished, and the monster emerged. Nero began to see himself as something greater than man, and far more dangerous than God. His pleasures became his politics. His desires became his decrees. He didn't rule Rome through justice or strength. He ruled it through fear, spectacle, and seduction. The empire bent not to his will, but to his whims. The same hands that strummed the lyre would sign the deaths of his family. The same lips that sang of love would whisper orders of torture. Nero's Rome was a world where beauty decayed into cruelty, where the artist painted his masterpiece in blood. And as his mind sank deeper into madness, his passions grew darker, more twisted, more unholy. In Nero's Rome, pleasure was not a sin, it was a weapon. Before he became an emperor, before the marble statues and golden palaces, Nero was a boy living in the shadow of a woman who believed she could shape a god. Her name was Agrippina, sister of an emperor, wife of another, and mother of Rome's next ruler. From the day he was born, Nero was never his own. Agrippina saw him as her masterpiece, her weapon. Every smile, every gesture, every ambition she planted into him was designed to serve her power. She wrapped him in silk, but her grip was iron. She taught him not how to love, but how to rule. As he grew, she reminded him constantly that he owed her everything. She whispered that he was destined for greatness, that he was not mortal, that his blood carried the divinity of Augustus himself. But beneath those words of devotion was control, the kind that smothered rather than nurtured. Roman whispers would later tell of their closeness. Too close, too intimate. Stories that she bathed with her son, that she flaunted her beauty before him, that she blurred the boundaries between mother and queen. Whether truth or rumor, those stories captured something deeper. Nero's earliest lessons about love were inseparable from power, dominance, and submission. When Nero was still a teenager, Agrippina made her most daring move. She seduced her way into the marriage bed of Emperor Claudius, her own uncle. With poison and patience, she cleared the path for her son's ascension. When Claudius died, some said by her hand, Nero became emperor at 16. Agrippina stood behind the throne, the true ruler of Rome, smiling beside her creation. In those first years, the empire called them divine, the perfect union of wisdom and youth. Coins were struck with both their faces. Statues were carved of mother and son side by side, as if they were gods reborn. But the illusion could not last. The boy she had molded into power began to taste it for himself. Nero discovered what it meant to be worshipped. Senators bowed, crowds chanted his name, poets compared him to Apollo. For the first time, he felt adored not because of his mother's hand, but despite it. And in that awakening came rebellion. Agrippina had taught him that love was power. Now he would turn that lesson against her. Their relationship became a war fought behind marble walls, poison disguised as affection, kisses that hid threats. She tried to remind him that he owed her everything. He began to see her as the one thing standing between him and divinity. Each confrontation between them grew more dangerous. She mocked his lovers, scolded his indulgence, and tried to control his choices. Nero responded with cruelty. He stripped her of titles, her guards, her influence, yet she would not yield. She threatened to expose him, to replace him with another heir. She forgot that she was no longer dealing with her son. She was facing her own creation, One night, Nero made his decision. The woman who had birthed an emperor would die by his command. The plan was theatrical, fitting for the son who saw life as a performance. He invited her to a grand feast, showered her with gifts, and sent her home on a specially designed ship. In the quiet of the night, that ship was meant to collapse and drown her at sea. But Agrippina, cunning as ever, swam to shore. When news reached Nero that she had survived, panic seized him. He imagined her marching on Rome, exposing his plot, seizing the throne. There could be no more pretenses, no more whispers of love. Only blood could silence her. He sent soldiers to her villa under the cover of darkness. When they arrived, she stood waiting, regal, fearless, almost mocking. She had played the game too long to plead. "Strike my womb," she is said to have told them, "for it bore Nero," and so they did. When the news of her death reached the palace, Nero collapsed. He paced, trembling, haunted by the image of her face. Some say he saw her ghost in every shadow. Others say he felt nothing but relief, a strange, cold emptiness. Whatever he felt, something inside him changed forever. By killing Agrippina, Nero did more than murder his mother. He destroyed the last piece of humanity within himself. From that moment, the boy who once played music in candlelight began to believe he was something greater, something untouchable. He began to speak of himself not as emperor, but as God. He dressed in gold and silk, painted his eyes like an actor, demanded that his subjects kneel as if in worship. Rome had given him power, but Agrippina had given him the belief that he deserved it absolutely. Now, freed from her shadow, he would test that power on everything, on love, on life, and on the bodies of those who dared to serve him. In the echo of his mother's death, Nero was reborn, not as a man, but as a deity of his own design. To possess power, Nero first had to destroy the woman who gave him life. Power had made Nero fearless. The death of his mother had torn away the last thread of restraint, and now the emperor no longer ruled for Rome, he ruled for himself. The Palatine Palace became his stage, and he, its only god. The boy who once performed songs for senators now performed cruelty for pleasure. The poet became a sadist, the emperor a predator. His palace glittered with gold, jewels, and mirrors, not to reflect beauty, but to reflect him. Every corridor, every chamber was designed to remind the world that nothing existed beyond his desire. Behind those marble doors, pleasure became ritual. Nobles, slaves, soldiers, and courtiers were summoned not as guests, but as props in Nero's endless theater of sin. What began as decadence soon became domination. He would dine while others were made to crawl. He would laugh while his victims begged for mercy. The acts he called games were whispers of a deeper sickness, an addiction to control. At night, Nero would vanish from the palace, disguising himself in rags and wandering the streets of Rome. His guards followed in silence as he prowled through taverns, alleys, and markets, searching for thrill in anonymity. He would attack strangers for sport, rob merchants, and assault women in the dark, then return to the palace and boast of his exploits as if they were acts of art. No one dared to question him. To resist was treason. To speak was death. In public, he pretended to love beauty, the theater, poetry, music. In private, beauty became his obsession, and possession became his proof of power. When he met Poppaea Sabina, the wife of one of his closest allies, he saw not a woman but a prize. Poppaea was the most admired woman in Rome, stunning, cunning, and ambitious. She understood Nero's ego and knew how to feed it. She flattered him, called him divine, and slowly became the only voice he heard. To have her, Nero abandoned his wife Octavia, a noble and gentle woman adored by the Roman people. But Nero did not care for the people's love, only their obedience. When the Senate hesitated to approve the divorce, he ordered false charges against Octavia, accusing her of adultery, and sent her into exile. Soon after, she was executed, her head delivered to Poppaea as a gift. Poppaea became empress, crowned in jewels and fear. For a while she ruled Nero's heart as Agrippina once ruled his mind. She fed his delusions, encouraged his extravagance, and convinced him that his art was divine. She told him he was not merely emperor, he was an artist of life and death. But Nero's love was a curse. Possession turned to paranoia, adoration to rage. Poppaea, pregnant with his child, once dared to scold him for spending too much time at the theater. In a fit of fury, he struck her. One blow, and the Empress of Rome fell lifeless at his feet. For days, Nero wandered the palace in despair, whispering her name through the halls. The man who had taken everything could not bear the thought of losing what he believed was his. He ordered her body embalmed with precious spices, dressed in gold, and laid within a marble tomb fit for a goddess. But the guilt remained. And then, from that guilt, came something far more disturbing. Among the young attendants in his court was a boy named Sporus, delicate, soft-featured, and eerily reminiscent of the dead empress. Nero became fixated. He ordered the boy castrated, dressed in silks, and declared him Poppaea reborn. The emperor paraded him through Rome as his new wife. They held a wedding ceremony, complete with vows, torches, and music. Nero himself played the bridegroom. The court watched in horror, but applauded in fear. The empire had become an audience to one man's madness. Sporus followed Nero everywhere, at banquets and ceremonies, even beside him on stage when the emperor performed. The boy was both pet and prisoner, a breathing memory of Nero's lost love and a living proof of his cruelty. In Nero's world, love had no warmth. It was performance, a dance of power, humiliation, and control. He didn't seek affection, he demanded surrender. Every lover, every victim was another mirror reflecting his dominance. The more the people feared him, the more he desired to be adored. The more he was adored, the more he needed to be feared. Pleasure and pain became indistinguishable. To him, both were expressions of the same divine right, to command life itself. As his passions deepened, so did his cruelty. The palace grew louder at night, filled with screams that mingled with laughter, music, and applause. The lines between theater and torture blurred completely. Those who survived described him as both actor and executioner, a man who believed his crimes were art. Beyond the palace walls, Rome began to change. Senators whispered in secret. Soldiers obeyed in silence. The streets spoke of a god who disguised himself as a beggar, who sang songs in the amphitheater while the bodies of his enemies burned in the distance. And yet, despite it all, Nero saw himself as pure, untouched by sin, above morality, beyond mortal judgment. His cruelty was not madness in his eyes. It was expression. It was creation. He had destroyed his mother to prove his power. Now he destroyed his lovers to prove his divinity. There was no line he would not cross, no soul he would not break, no beauty he would not defile to feed the hunger inside him. He didn't seek love. He sought reflections of his own power. Every act of intimacy was an act of conquest. In Nero's world, even love bled for entertainment. For Nero, life itself had become a stage, and Rome, his unwilling audience. He no longer saw the empire as a realm to govern, but as a theater built for his pleasure. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, every act of cruelty or affection was a performance designed to draw gasps from the crowd. He didn't crave pleasure. He craved witness. From his earliest years, he believed that art could make him immortal. He saw musicians and actors receive applause that generals could never earn. To Nero, that applause was divine, the sound of worship. As emperor, he demanded it not from artists, but from everyone. He wanted senators to cheer him, slaves to bow, and gods themselves to watch in awe. He built theaters across Rome, adorned with gold and silk, not for the people's entertainment, but for his own. There he performed songs, recited poetry, and acted out tragic plays. The emperor of Rome sang of heartbreak, of love, of death, while his soldiers stood in silence and his nobles pretended to weep. No one dared to look away, for even a glance of boredom could mean exile, or worse. But Nero's art was not confined to the stage. His entire life became a performance of desire, cruelty, and shame. The line between theater and depravity dissolved until they became one. At his command, Rome's most powerful men and women were dragged into grotesque spectacles he called divine plays. Senators' wives, noble daughters, and courtiers were stripped of dignity, costumed in mythic attire, and forced to perform before him. He would sit upon a gilded throne, cloaked in the robes of a god, and watch as Rome's elite acted out his fantasies, scenes of seduction, betrayal, and death. To Nero, this was art, the art of power, the art of humiliation. Each performance was a reminder that no one in Rome, no matter how noble or sacred, could escape his will. He could make them sing, dance, or kneel with a single glance. Their humiliation was his triumph. He staged marriages that were mockeries of love, orgies disguised as operas, and feasts that turned into carnivals of madness. Each event was grander, stranger, darker than the last. One evening, he hosted what he called the marriage of the gods. He appeared dressed as Apollo, the god of light, while his chosen partner, sometimes male, sometimes female, was made to play the goddess of love. Before hundreds of onlookers, he would reenact the union of divinity and flesh, declaring it a sacred performance. To those who attended, it was nothing short of blasphemy, but no one dared to protest. They smiled, they clapped, they praised his genius. The empire had learned that survival depended on applause. What began as performance soon spilled into every corner of life. Nero's palace became both theater and prison, a world where the roles never ended. He surrounded himself with actors, dancers, and musicians who worshipped him not as a ruler, but as the living embodiment of art. Those who refused were punished. Those who hesitated were made examples of. Behind closed doors, the performances grew darker. Nero arranged private plays that blurred the line between performance and violation. People were forced to play parts they could not escape. Desire was choreographed, humiliation rehearsed. To him, suffering was a kind of music, another note in his symphony of control. He even declared festivals in his own honor, the Neronia, where he competed in races, poetry, and song. Of course, no one else was allowed to win. When he took the stage, the judges trembled, knowing the outcome was already written. Nero would receive the crown, the applause, and the tears of a terrified audience. The Emperor of Rome had become an actor obsessed with his own image, a man so intoxicated by performance that reality no longer mattered. But the more he performed, the less he felt alive. The cheers began to sound hollow, the praise too rehearsed. He needed something real, something that would make him feel again. And so, his art turned inward. His body, his lovers, his victims, all became instruments of expression. He began to reenact scenes of myth, casting himself as gods and heroes. In one grotesque performance, he played the role of Hercules, slaying beasts and rescuing maidens. Only the beasts were men, and the maidens unwilling captives. In another, he portrayed Jupiter, king of the gods, taking mortal lovers by force, insisting that he was reenacting divine destiny. Even in private, he could not separate lust from theater. When he took lovers, he ordered them to act, to cry, to applaud. It wasn't enough to satisfy desire. They had to witness it, to play their parts as though the world depended on it. His sexuality had become theater, and his partners, unwilling actors. Rumors spread that Nero would appear on stage wrapped in animal skins, acting out scenes of brutal assault, screaming and writhing before an audience who could not look away. It was said he believed these performances purified him, that through art, even horror could become sacred. For the Roman elite, each event was a nightmare dressed in gold. They were forced to attend, to smile through their terror, to call his madness divine. Behind their masks of devotion, they hated him. But fear was stronger than hate, and silence was safer than truth. Even the Senate, once the proud heart of Roman authority, became a gathering of actors. Every decree was a script, every speech rehearsed to please the emperor. Nero had turned governance into performance, morality into farce, and Rome into his audience of slaves. The city itself reflected his insanity. Temples were renamed in his honor, statues of gods were carved with his face, musicians sang hymns to his beauty. He demanded that Rome itself become his mirror, a living testament to his divine ego. Yet beneath the marble and music, the city began to rot. The people murmured of famine, of fire, of fear, but Nero heard none of it. He was lost in his own performance, deafened by applause that no longer came from hearts, but from trembling lips. The emperor who once sought beauty now worshipped spectacle. The man who once desired love now demanded devotion. The boy who once dreamed of art now used art to disguise his madness. He no longer saw the difference between truth and illusion, cruelty and creation, desire and destruction. In his mind, Rome itself existed to serve his stage, a city built not of stone and blood, but of eyes watching him, mouths praising him, hearts breaking beneath his performance. And as he stood in the glow of torchlight, bathed in the sound of forced applause, Nero smiled. The emperor of Rome no longer ruled by law, but by desire. In the final years of his reign, Nero no longer saw the world as it was. Reality had dissolved into a haze of nightmares and visions, a theater where ghosts replaced men, and memories whispered louder than the living. The empire trembled, but Nero could hear only the echo of his own songs. His days were ruled by paranoia. He saw betrayal in every glance, conspiracy in every silence. Senators whispered of his madness, soldiers mocked his vanity, and even his servants trembled under his gaze. He trusted no one, not even the gods he once claimed as kin. At night, he roamed the corridors of his golden palace, haunted by the shadows of the dead. Agrippina, his mother, whose ghost he swore appeared in mirrors. Poppaea, the wife he killed with his own hands. And Sporus, the living ghost who bore her face. To Nero, the line between life and death had become a thread he could twist at will. He began to believe he could conquer even mortality, that his power extended beyond the grave. He held ceremonies to speak with spirits, mixing incense and blood in bowls of gold. He called them sacred rites, but they were rituals of obsession. In these performances of mourning, pleasure, and horror entwined, Sporus was always beside him, the castrated boy who had become his bride, the living echo of Poppaea. Nero dressed him in the empress's robes, adorned him with jewels, and whispered to him as though she still lived. Before his court, he declared the union divine, calling Sporus, "my dead wife reborn." The empire looked on in silence. No one dared speak. They saw the emperor standing beside a trembling boy painted as a woman, his face pale beneath the weight of a crown. It was not love. It was madness given ceremony. Outside the palace, Rome began to rot. Famine spread through the city. The treasury emptied into Nero's endless games and monuments. The people muttered that the gods had turned away. And then, one night, the sky itself seemed to echo their anger. A fire began in the merchant district. The flames spread quickly, devouring the wooden homes and narrow streets. Within hours, the city of marble was wrapped in smoke and ash. The night glowed red and the air filled with screams. No one knew how it started. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered that Nero himself had ordered it, a divine act of destruction to make room for his next creation. As the fire raged, the emperor did not flee. He stood upon a high balcony, watching as the flames swallowed his empire. And then, as witnesses later swore, he began to sing. He performed verses of tragedy, his voice rising over the roar of fire, his lyre in hand. He sang of Troy, of gods and heroes, of the beauty of death. To Nero, it was not disaster. It was theater. The city burned, and he was the star. For 6 days and 7 nights the fire consumed Rome. Entire districts vanished. Temples, homes, and lives turned to smoke. When the embers cooled, the city lay in ruin. Tens of thousands were dead. The people searched for someone to blame, and their eyes turned to him. Whispers spread that the emperor had watched their suffering as entertainment, that he had found pleasure in their despair. To silence the anger, Nero looked for a scapegoat. He chose the Christians, a small, strange sect, despised by many. He accused them of arson, ordered mass arrests, and turned their executions into another form of spectacle. In the gardens of his palace, he staged their deaths as public performance. Some were torn apart by dogs, others burned alive to light his feasts. As they screamed, Nero mingled among the crowd, smiling beneath the glow of human torches. To him, even death could be art. But with each act of cruelty, the empire's faith in him faded. The Senate conspired in secret, the legions turned their loyalty elsewhere, and the people who once cheered his name now spatted in hatred. Still, Nero clung to his illusions. He built a new palace on the ashes of the old, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Its halls were lined with jewels, its ceilings painted with stars. In its center stood a colossal statue of himself, taller than any god. He called it the Colossus Neronis. It was his monument to eternity, a world reborn in his image, but the ghosts would not leave him. He saw Agrippina's face in the marble, heard Poppaea's voice in the wind, felt Sporus's silent terror beside him. He began to speak of omens, of gods turning away, of voices that sang to him in the night. Then came the revolt. Provinces rose in rebellion. Armies declared new emperors. Even his own guards abandoned him. The empire he had turned into a stage now collapsed beneath its own weight. Nero fled Rome in disguise, accompanied by a few loyal slaves, among them Sporus. For days they hid in the countryside, moving from villa to villa as word spread that the Senate had condemned him to death. The actor who had once commanded the world now played the role of a fugitive. When soldiers closed in, Nero knew his final performance had come. He refused to let others dictate his ending. Sitting in a dark chamber, trembling, he turned to his servant and whispered, "Is this what it means to die?" No one dared answer. He placed a dagger to his throat, too afraid to strike, until one of his men guided his hand. His final words were said to be, "What an artist dies in me." The man who once sang as Rome burned had finally fallen silent. His body was hurriedly buried in secret, without crown or ceremony. The empire rejoiced, but the scars he left behind never healed. Nero had turned Rome into a reflection of himself, beautiful, dying, and consumed by fire. And though centuries would pass, the legend of his madness would never fade. Some Romans whispered that he never truly died, that one day he would return, singing once more, to reclaim his burning throne. Rome became the reflection of its emperor, beautiful, dying, and consumed by fire. The end came not with a roar, but with silence. The emperor who once commanded armies, who made the world his stage, now stumbled through the outskirts of his own empire, hunted, abandoned, forgotten. The streets of Rome that once echoed with his songs now cursed his name. He fled through the night, disguised in rags, his golden crown traded for fear. The senators had declared him an enemy of the state. The guards who once bowed before him now searched to drag him in chains. And the people, his audience, his beloved crowd, rejoiced at his downfall. In a small villa outside the city, Nero hid with a handful of slaves. He could still hear the hoofbeats of the soldiers coming for him, the drums of vengeance closing in. The empire he had tried to mold in his image was crumbling beneath his feet. His world of marble and gold had turned to dust and ash. For the first time, Nero was truly alone. No adoring faces, no music, no applause, only the echo of his own breath, and the ghosts of all he had destroyed. He asked his companions a question that chilled even them. "Is there no one left who loves me?" None dared to answer. And then, as he heard the riders approaching, Nero understood that the final act of his tragedy had arrived. He would not let them see him humiliated, paraded through the streets like a beast. He would direct his own ending. With trembling hands, he lifted the dagger. His voice, once thunderous, now broke to a whisper. "What an artist dies in me." Those were his last words, the confession of a man who had mistaken his cruelty for genius, his madness for art. A final performance, delivered to an audience of none. When the blade fell, so did the empire's illusion. The tyrant who called himself divine died like any mortal, terrified and forgotten. His body was buried in haste, without honor, without tears. Rome celebrated his death, believing the nightmare was over. But Nero's shadow lingered. His ghost haunted the palaces of emperors for generations. Pretenders rose, claiming to be his spirit returned, and the people, remembering both his terror and his spectacle, believed. Even in death, Nero remained the mirror of Rome's soul, brilliant, monstrous, and consumed by its own fire. He had turned love into torture and art into death. And in doing so, he revealed the darkest truth of power, that when a man begins to believe he is a god, humanity itself becomes his victim. Rome rejoiced when he fell, but beneath the celebration lay a whisper of fear, because every empire carries a little of Nero within it, the hunger for beauty, the lust for control, the fire that never stops burning. In his hunger for divinity, Nero forgot he was human, and when gods fall, even empires burn.